Recording in progress.
Good evening, everybody.
Kavod Haraf, how are you?
Hashem, thank God. Okay, so we're starting with Bet. So we said in the tour like this, right? That there's this one rabbi, Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yuda, and he says, right, that that's talking about only, the maximum amount that we talked about yesterday, which is, 3.5 pounds, right, in our language. In the right, he says that only applies if your oven is small, but if your oven is large, it doesn't apply. So regarding that, says the Bet Yosef, "Ze lashon ha-Mordechi," right? This is the language of the Mordechi. He says, "Bepek elu avrin," right? And he says over there in this parak, "Piresh Rabbeinu Yitzchak Bar Yuda dehane mile betanunahem shayu ktanim." So that only applies to their ovens, which were small. V'ikal mechash lechimutz shayu tzrichim lechamem mechol isa. So then we're concerned about leavening. When you have to heat up the whole, right? They had to heat up the whole dough. Veisa, every dough. Aval tanurim didan. But it says when it comes to our ovens, adif teve lalush arbe biyachad. So he says then it's even better to do a larger amount. It's even better, preferable, right? Okay, interesting. So he says, um, אבל סמכי ושאר גאונים, right? החמירו. So he says, but right, these geonim, right, these big rabbis, they were stringent, bidawar, in this matter. Right. So in other words, they were not lenient regarding a big oven. The same thing. In other words, the same standard applies to every oven. That's the way. That's the way it is. והגות מימון כתב פרק מה שאין לנו נזהרים בזה. So he says this rabbi, Hagot Maimon, that which we're not really careful about this, ואנו לשים יסוד גדולות יחד, אנו סמכים על דברי רביה. So he says, that he says we're not really particular about this. What does that mean? That we need even larger doughs, right, than the ones we described yesterday. We do a larger. And he says, so what are we relying on, right? So he says we're relying on the Ravia, right? Ve'arokach, and the Rokach also. Ve'shar Gedolei Ashkenaz. So there's also other Ashkenazi rabbis, right? Big rabbis. She'tiru lalush isa gdola. They allowed to even need a larger dough. Kifi ma sheyesh bnei adam ozrim. So he says, according to V'tovu lalush kach kol kach shiu kulam. So he says the reason is okay. So now he gets into the whole details, right? He says that we have a lot of people, who are helping, with the baking process. We have a lot of workers there, in the bakery, whatever. So because of that, right, we can handle, like a large dough. Because of that, you have a lot of manpower there, So that's what they're relying on. That's what he says, right? So he says, "V'tovu lalush kol kach shiyu kulam v'chol הכלים עסוקים בבצק, וזה טוב יותר ממה שיהיו מקצתם פנויים והתחמץ הבצק." So he says it's good that you should do enough of a dough, he says, right, that everybody should be busy. The whole bakery is like busy, with their baking process. So he says it's better that way, that everybody's busy. But when some people are like busy and some people are just like hanging around doing nothing, so he said that's more dangerous, actually. Interesting. Why is that? Because when they're not moving, right, the problem is it's going to become leavened. As we said yesterday, right, that all the while that you're agitating the dough, you're moving it around, right, manipulating it, it doesn't leaven. It only leavens when you stop agitating it, So therefore, that's why I'm saying, right, it's better than everybody should be busy. אוקיי, וכן רבי יצחק בר יהודה בביתו היו רגילים לרוש שני אמרים או שלושה יחד. So he says in this rabbi's house, they would do like, much larger, than what we described yesterday. In other words, about 2 or 3 times, larger than what we described. So what are we talking about? We're talking about like 10 pounds, right? They were doing, something like that, right? Instead of doing 3.5 like we do, they were doing 10 pounds. Okay, whatever, something like that. So interesting. Um, so it says ואמר שלא הקפיד התלמוד כי אם עליהם שתנוריהם היו קטנים. So it says the Talmud was only stringent about the case where the ovens are small, like in those days. Uh, ובקל מסתנן. So he says because of that, it can cool down easily. Interesting. ואולי יצטרכו המצות לעמוד זמן ארוך. So therefore, right, since the oven has a tendency to cool down, the matzah may have to stand there, just wait until the oven heats up. So they're getting to a dangerous situation there, where can leaven. So therefore, right, this is that's the reason why that they had a limit, on the size. Okay, so it goes on about tanurim shalom, but he says our ovens though, which are larger, as we said, right? Gedolim hem ve'en lachush lazeh. So we're not concerned about this issue. Omnam Rabbi Meir eno somech al zeh. But he says Rabbi Meir, right, who's probably Rabbi Meir Mirotenberg, right, or the famous rabbi from Germany. So, right, he holds that he wasn't particular about this. So I'm sorry, I didn't say the right word. Not that he wasn't particular, but he wasn't relying on this leniency, right? That's what we're saying. Okay. So he says, therefore, he wouldn't do more than the size of challah, right? As we mentioned already 10 times, right? 20 times, 3.5 pounds, right? That was the limit that he did. He wouldn't do more than that, which is the size of challah. Okay, so good. Kataba agur. So he says, this rabbi, right? He says you should listen to him, right? In other words, be stringent like this rabbi was, Rabbi Meir. Be stringent like Rabbi Meir. And so meaning what? That don't let things get out of hand, using a large dough, much larger than what we described. Shouldn't do that. Okay, good. So then he goes on to say, Katava Agur, B'divrei HaGeonim, right? So he brings this rabbi, Agur, right? Matzati Rabbi Nitir Lalush ולכתף במילת עץ, לפי שממהר להשלים מלאכתו. So he says, right, that this my rabbi he allowed to knead, right, and to also do the basting, right, whatever, with something made out of wood, לפי שממהר להשלים מלאכתו, because this way it goes fast. He does the work very fast. So he says that's only as again, right, regarding their ovens. Shepihem lemala, because in those days, right, the ovens, the door was on top, right? Not like our ovens where the door is on the side, right? אבל בתנורים שלנו יותר טוב ללוש הרבה יחד. But it says in our ovens where the door is on the side, better to actually to do make a bigger dough actually. שיבולת לקט. אוקיי, ואני המחבר ראיתי שנוהגים בעלי נפש באשכנז ללוש כדי שיעור חלה לבד אפילו בתנורים גדולים. So he says, right, the saintly rabbis, in Ashkenaz, right, in Germany, they were stringent about this, even though there was room to be lenient, as we said, right, but they were stringent. So meaning what? That they would not go over the size of challah, right? That's what. Okay, good. So in other words, we're pretty much seeing like a trend over here, right? The trend is that you should try to stay within the limits of the size of challah, when you're making a matzah dough. This keeps you out of trouble. That's all. Very simple, right? So your dough shouldn't come to leaven. Okay, good. So because when you're working with a large batch, you need more manpower, you need more, labor there, right? So, it just makes things a little bit more difficult, a little bit more, right, on the edge, a little bit, right? Like, you're at the limit. So, you got to work very hard and, you got to, right, make sure everything is, well oiled and well greased, right? The whole operation, right? And that's sometimes difficult to do. So therefore, we try to avoid that. That's what he's trying to say. Okay, good. So good. Katava Rabbeinu Yonah, right? It says Rabbeinu Yonah, "Hecha shalosh shelash yoter mizeh hashiur." So he says, what about if he made a larger size, right? Uh, so the question is, right? What's the din, right? B'diavad. If he made it larger, can we eat that, or do we have to, throw it away or something, whatever, right? Give it to a goy, whatever. What should we do there? So he says, right, that this comes from the tour, by the way. We saw this yesterday. So he says, I saw Chachmet Sarfat, right, the rabbis of France. Hayu osrim oto. So they forbade that dough, right? If you made it like that. So meaning what? If you made it more than 3.5 pounds, right? So you made it like 5 pounds, let's say, right? So they would tell you, okay, well, throw it in the garbage, right? Don't use that. Okay. ונראה להתיר מיהו לדעת הגאונים שכתבו שלכתחילה אין להניח ריסה. But he says, right, that there are also some other rabbis who were lenient about this, so meaning what, the b'diavad, they would allow you to use that dough, right, even if you made it larger. So meaning what, according to them, the prohibition is only lechatchila, right? But b'diavad, after the fact, once you already made it large, you don't have to throw it away, you can use it, according to, so it's a machloket, right, we see between certain groups of rabbis here, right? Whether b'diavad you can use that dough or not to eat from. Okay, good. So it goes on. ורבנו קיצר פה הלשון ולכן אין דבריו מובנים. So he says here, it says Bet Yosef, the Tur, right, shortened the language here, right, when he quoted all this stuff. And therefore he says, right, his words are not really readily understood, a little bit, right, fuzzy, a little bit cloudy there. So you'll have to work that out. So he says, therefore, right, to help you with this matter, what am I going to do? He says, I'm going to give you the language of the Rosh, right, which the Rosh is the source of the Tur. So he says, from there, you'll understand, right, better the language that we're talking about here. זה לשון הראש, פרק אלו דברים. This is the language of the Rosh, he says. כתוב בשם רבנו יונה, right, that it says in the name of רבנו יונה, היכא דלש יותר מזה השיעור, if you did, right, more than this measure that we mentioned, so חכמי צרפת, the rabbis of France, אוסרין האיסה, they would forbid this dough, right? ונראה לי להתיר דתמא דהי שיעורא משום, so he says, it seems to me, to allow this, he says, to be lenient. Why? Because he says the reason for this size that we mentioned, right? Mishum de aminan kol zman she'oskin bebatzek, because as we said yesterday, all the while that you're manipulating the dough, right? You're agitating it, right? Eno bali dechimutz, doesn't leaven, right? That's a trick you should know, by the way. The famous trick. The famous trick is, as long as you're manipulating the dough, it does not leaven. That can go even for an hour. But you're going to get tired. To manipulate the dough for that long, but in theory, right, it could go for a long time. Okay, so let's go on. So he says, ושיעורו שבזה, ושיעור המועיל עסק הידיים, אפילו כל היום. So he says you can even do that all day, he says. Can you imagine? All day, wow. וביותר, אין הידיים מספיקות להתעסק בה, מתוך גודלה, מכל מקום. So he says the problem is when you make it too large, right? So then you can't manipulate it so good. It's just too much of a load there, right? Too much to handle. So that's why we don't want it to be too large. מתוך גודלה, ומכל מקום, כיוון שאפילו אם לא נתעסקו בה, כלל אינו אסורה. But he says, since he knows that even if they were not, right, manipulating it so, so much all the time, it's not forbidden, ella ad mil, it's only forbidden after 18 minutes, right? 18 minutes is your time limit when you're not manipulating it, right? So. זה העסק שמתעסקים בה, אף על פי שאין זה כדאי לא גרע ממה שלא התעסקו בה כלל. So he says, therefore, right, that's the same as, when they don't do nothing to it. וכיוון שאין נוהין, שוהין בה יותר משיעור מיל, so since they don't wait until 18 minutes, in other words, they do it really fast, they get it into the oven really fast, these are like people who are baking, in the bakeries, and the matza bakeries, they're very quick, they're very industrious. So what they do is, they have the matzah in the oven by 5 minutes, So they don't even come close to 18 minutes, what I mean? It's like far, far off. They work very quickly. They're very, right, industrious, as we said. So, they're just moving along very fast. Okay, good. מותר, מיעוט, לדעת הגאונים שאמרו שלכתחילה אין להניח חייסה רגע אחד. But he says, right, the גאונים, they said that nevertheless, right, even though you do have 18 minutes, right, as your maximum, time, but nevertheless, right, you shouldn't let the dough rest at all. In other words, you should always be manipulating it, right? Coaxing it, whatever, right? Massaging it, whatever it is, right? Moving it around all the time. So if you're doing that, right, you're good. So therefore, right, lechatchila, even though you do have 18 minutes, but we want you to be on the safe side, right, and always move it around, manipulate. Okay. אם כן, לכתחילה אין ללוש יותר מזה השיעור. So he says, therefore, לכתחילה, right, you shouldn't do more than this size that we mentioned, right, 3.5 pounds. Okay, good. עד כאן, so he says, that's the end of it. ותמיאני על מי שעלה על דעתו, so he says, I'm wondering about the person who thought, לאסור, right, to forbid this even בדיעבד, התנן בפרק שתהיה לכם, because we learned in מנחות, צריך ד' עמוד א', לחם הפנים נלוש אחד, וכתיב שני עשרונים יהיה החלה אחד, ונהה שהחמירו החכמים שלא לרוש אלא עשרון אחד, כל מקום היח עלה על דעתם לאסור בדיעבד, עד כאן לשון הראש ז"ל. So he says, right, he brings here the language of the Rosh, something interesting. So he says, right, that, if you're going to tell me, right, that the b'diavad it's going to be asur, if you did more than, right, 3.5 pounds, so he says, I have some news for you, right, it shouldn't be like that. Why? Because it says in Menachot, in the Gemara there, it's like Dal Amud Aleph, right? That what? That in the temple, right, when they made the showbread, right, which is called lechem panim, right, the bread of faces, right, whatever they call it, right? So he says that bread, each loaf was like twice this size. So in other words, each loaf was about 7 pounds. So so they were not concerned, right, that it was going to become leavened. So you see from there, right? It says the Rosh that if b'diavad you made it larger, than that size that we mentioned, so you do have what to rely on, because that's what they did in the temple. So you see that's okay. Hope you guys are following me. So here's a trick, right? You guys should know. I'm not sure if you know this, but right, the bread that was made, the showbread there, right, whatever they call it, was matzah. It was not leavened bread. It was matzah. So that's why we're learning from there about these rules, because it's also matzah. So the interesting thing is, that bread was, 7 pounds each loaf. It's a large loaf. You know what I mean? And nevertheless, it also was very thick, you know? So nevertheless, right, even though it was large and thick, they were not concerned that it would get leavened. Interesting. But he says, right, that lechatchila anyway, you have to be careful. In other words, not to make it more than the size we mentioned. Why is that? Because even though they did that in the temple, but when it comes to household use, right, that's a different thing. You can't expect the household, situation to be as good as it was in the temple. You know what I mean? The temple, people over there, the Kohanim, they were professionals over these guys. So they were like very experienced, and very, right, and very quick with their hands. So, you can't compare yourself to what they were doing over there. So therefore, right, the Chadchila, we should try to do less than they did, meaning what, about half, right, of what they did. And right, this way, you have a chance of right, having no problems, right? Your chances are much higher. So he says, כתב רבנו ירוחם, says this rabbi, יש מהפוסקים כתבו שאם לש יותר, shapat asura. So he brings also, right, this machloket that we just mentioned, which is that some rabbis say that if you did more, right, than you're supposed to, it's asur b'diavad. וכן נראה עיקר זולתי, so he says that seems to be the halacha, he says. That's forbidden. זולתי אם עשתו במזיד, unless, right, unless he did it on purpose, ואם נראה אפילו עשתו במזיד, so says Bet Yosef, right, it seems to me that even if he did it on purpose, nami shara, it's still allowed. כיוון דאיקרא דשרע אפילו דכתחילה, because some people allow this לכתחילה, כמו שנתבהר בסמוך, like we already explained, right? ומיהו לכתחילה יש לכל בעל נפש להיזהר. But it says לכתחילה, right? Everybody who's God-fearing should be careful, right? Not to go above that limit that we set. שלא ללוש יותר מעשרון אפילו בתנור גדול. Even in a big oven, he says, right? By the way, our ovens, are they large or are they small? The truth is, that our ovens are relatively large, according, compared to what they had. They probably had smaller ones. So nevertheless, right, even though our ovens are relatively large, nevertheless, we should try to, right, keep this rule, and not do more than 3.5 pounds. Okay, so in other words, basically, right, what we're saying is that the largest loaf you should make is 3.5 pounds, right? Anything larger than that, you're getting into great territory there, right? Dangerous territory, whatever. You don't want to get into that. Okay, very good. And by the way, today, we make them much smaller than that, right? The matzot that we have today are much smaller. So we're not even close to that limit, what I mean? We're far away from that. I don't think each matzah, weighs even, right, it's not even a pound. I mean, it's much less. 100 grams, 200 grams, 300 grams, depending on the size, right? There's different types. That's about it. Okay, very good. So, today we're doing everything like extra safe, extra careful. We're much more stringent today than they were in those days. They had a little bit more leeway in those days because they knew what they were doing more. They were more professional. They were more experienced, whatever, handy. They were more handy. So they knew how to do these things better than we do. Okay, so that's the story, right? Good. אפילו יש הרבה בני אדם עוזרים. Says even if you have a lot of workers, right, who are helping you, nevertheless, he says you shouldn't make it bigger than that. There you go, right? So language is clear. So then he goes on. יש נוהגים ללוש עיסתה, עיסרון. So he says some have a custom that they make, right, their dough, each one, right, as we said, 3.5 pounds. ואחר כך בשעת הכיתוף מחברים שני העשרונים. So it says, but after they baste it, right, then what they do is they put them together, they bring them together, מקטפים אותן יחד, and then they baste it together, ונראה שלא הועילו כלום בתקנתם שלא עשו חכמים לרוש יותר מסרון, אלא מפני שלא יחמיץ בשעת הכיתוף, וכמו שכתב רבנו ירוחם. So he says, that doesn't really help you, to do it this way. So he says, because you're still transgressing the words of the rabbis who told you, right, that we don't want you to make it too large. Why is that? Because when you baste it, right, it comes, that's when the danger comes in there. So if you're basing it again after if you combine it, so what does it help you to do it that way? That you're transgressing the words of the rabbis. וזה לשונו, אין נשים בפסח יותר משיעור חלה, דקים להו לרבנן, שאין שום אישה יכולה לכתף בידיה, אישה יותר עבה מזה. Oh, so he says, right, that the reason he says why the maximum size is 3.5 pounds is because we hold, right, we measured this, whatever, the rabbis measured, I don't know, whatever, right, that no woman can handle a dough larger than that, right, and baste it properly and whatever, without having it become leavened. So it's just too much, too much, right, too much to work with. It's too big of a load there for a woman to handle such a large loaf like that. Okay, good. The Ashur Bilti Achimutz, it says, right, that to avoid it leavening, when it's going to be larger than that, it's going to be hard for a woman. V'gam hu katab be'edia listor binhag zeh. So he says he also wrote explicitly to contradict this custom. V'zeh lashano, that's what he says. Ve'ena yechola lekatef u'litasek b'isa gdola yoter mizeh hashiur כי מה תועלת יש ללוש זו המידה ואחר כך לערב שתי מידות יחד ולכתף אותם בידיים. So he also says, right, this rabbi, that, doing it like this, right, we just mentioned, right, a minute ago, that you're going to make like two loaves, which are, maximum size, and then combine them together afterwards, So then what does it help you, right? You're still transgressing the words of the rabbis by making it too big and then basting it, So you get a problem. Okay, good. So goes on to say, ואינה יכולה לכתף ולהתעסק בעיסה גדולה יותר מזה השיעור, כי מה תועלת יש ללוש זו המידה, ואחר כך, okay, we already read this, I'm sorry, let's go on. So he says, ואף על פי שהם טוענים דלא אמרו, even though it says they're claiming that the rabbis only said this shiur zeh, right, this size, מקטפים בידיהם, when they're basting with their hands, אבל אנן מקטפים בעמילה, but he says we do it, with some kind of a, right, uh, kind of a thing there, like a coating. אפילו עיסה גדולה כמה אינה מחמצת, right? So it said then, even if you have a large dough, it's not going to become leavened. לאו טענה היא, so that's not really a claim. דאם כן, למה להם שלא ללוש יותר מיסרון? So it says, if that's the case, then why shouldn't they need more than, right, the 3.5 pounds? ועוד, אחר כיתוף דהמילה מקטפינן בידיים. So it says also, after the right, after we baste the coating, then we do it with the hands. So he says then, right, there's concern that it's going to come leavened. More than the size, if it's more than the size. Okay. So that's bet, right? So we'll do the Shulchan Aruch here. That was quite large. Okay. So yeah, the Shulchan Aruch is not quite large. So it says, right, Im lash yoter mishiur zeh. So he says, right, that if he needs a larger size than this, like, what do we say? What is this? 3.5 pounds, right? If it does 5 pounds, whatever, right? Mutar b'diavad. So b'diavad it's mutar. So there you go, right? So the rule is that, the rabbis only said this lechatchila, you should make it that size and not more. But if you did it more, b'diavad, right, the matzah is still considered to be kosher. So in other words, we don't assume that you leavened it, just because you made it a little bit too large. It's just that we have a concern about that, but it's not exactly like a sure thing. As we brought, the case of the temple, right? That over there they were making it very large, and still they were not concerned. Okay, very good. So let's see what else we got here. We got Gimel. So says the Tur over here. En modedin kemach biyom tov lalush biyom tov של פסח שאסור ללוש יותר מעשרון ייקח בעומד הדעת. So he says, right, that when you're, making, right, on Yom Tov, bread. So he says you're not allowed to measure, right, the flour. Why is that? Because on Yom Tov we're not allowed to measure, right? Same thing on Shabbat, right? Shabbat and Yom Tov, measuring is prohibited. There are certain types of measuring which are permitted, like mitzvah stuff, mitzvah. But in general, right, measuring is not allowed. So here, there's really no mitzvah to measure it because, who really cares? How much exactly, precisely it is. You know what I mean? You can estimate. So therefore, it's not really something which is necessary to measure the precise amount that you have. You could just do it, by estimation. Like a lot of women, right? The ladies, right? They know. Right? They don't measure nothing. The real good cooks, the ladies who cook well, right? They don't measure nothing. Everything is just like they throw it in, because they estimate, with their eyes, they can see how much you need. So, that's the way it is, right? You know, right, that if a person is measuring his stuff when he's cooking, he's not a professional cook because professionals don't measure. Okay, so it goes on here, right? So he says, what should you do? Just do an estimation. You know what I mean? Don't measure precisely. ולא ירבה על isaron, right? So it says, but just don't make it bigger than, 3.5 pounds, as we said, right? But doesn't have to, you don't have to, measure the exact amount, how much the displacement is or how much the weight is, it's okay, You know more or less what's going on, you know what I mean? So that's it. Okay, that's the tour. So let's go Bit Yosef. So he says here, right, that the Bit Yosef, Besopek in Sadin, right? Where is the source for this? In Betza, right? Chavtet Amud Aleph. It tells you over there that you're not allowed to measure on Yom Tov. Ifligu Rab Ushmuel, right? He says there was a machloket between, right, dispute between Rab and Shmuel, right? Modedet isha b'yom tov kimach leisata. If the woman is allowed, they have a dispute about this, whether the woman is allowed to measure her, right, flour for the dough. The Katvu Tosfot says Tosfot, the afilu man deshara, even the one according to the one who allows, hainu that's only the didhu shayu notnin chalal kohen. That's only by them. Why is that? Because they were giving challah to the kohen, So, kilkach shara limdod kadesh titol challah b'ain yafe. So he says, therefore you're allowed to measure. Why? Because you want to give the kohen, right, his challah, right, in a generous manner. אבל אנו שאין נותנים חלה לכהן, but he says, we don't give the challah to the kohen, right? What do? We throw it away, right? We burn it. So, what do you need to measure it for so much, so precisely? אלא שורפין אותה, אין למדוד, אלא יש לנו, so we shouldn't measure it, therefore. לשער מעובד. So he says, therefore, right, יש לנו לשער מעובד, we just do estimation, right? Estimate. ושתהיה ברווח כשיעור מפני, right? It says it should be, enough, right? For sure. The right, make sure that you have some slack there, right? The size, מפני הברכה, to make the blessing, right? The challah. וכן בפסח נמי, says, יש להיזהר מלמדוד ביום טוב, למצתו, right? So he says also, right, when you're making matzot on Passover, right, he says, you should also be careful, like, not to measure everything, the flour and this, measure, just do estimation. צריך לעשות פחות מכשיעור, ולא ימדוד במידה. So he says, therefore, what you should do is make it a little bit less, since we're estimating, right? Do a little bit less than the maximum size. This way you know you're safe. ולא ימדוד במידה שאסור, למדוד בכל, בצמצום. It says, don't use like a measuring cup, that you shouldn't do. Because that's like very precise. That we don't want. Okay, good. אלא יפחות או יוסיף או עם המידה קטנה. So he says, if the size is small, whatever, right, whatever, just, do a little bit less than more. Don't be so precise with the measurement. והראש כתב, והראש כתב, הריף והרמב"ם, so it says the Rosh, the Rif and the Rambam, the Itur, also the Itur, pasku keman de asar limdod kemach b'yom tov. They paskin like the one who forbids to measure flour on Yom Tov. וכן זהירות הנשים שלא למדוד במידה שמודדים בה בחול. So there's also the women are careful, about that. They don't use measuring cups for, right, like they use on the weekdays, right? On weekdays you can use a measuring cup. But when it comes to, right, Shabbat and Yom Tov, we don't do that. אלא פוחתות או מוסיפות. Therefore you just add a little bit or just subtract a little bit inaccurate, right? ואף למתירים, so it's even the ones who are allow this, היינו דווקא בימיהם, since that was only in their time, שהיו נותנים אחד מ-24 חלה. Because they were giving, right, the chala to the Kohen, one out of 24. The tam zeh lo she'ach haidna. It says now this, but not relevant, right? You don't give the chala to the Kohen. But it says on Passover, right, as we said, that we don't do more than 3.5 pounds. וגם אין לפחות משיעור חלה, and also, right, we don't want to decrease from the sides of chala. אפשר שדומה לנטילת חלה בעין יפה. So it could be that it resembles the case of giving chala generously, the matirin, according to the ones who are permitting. עד כאן יש לנו, ורבנו לא סמך על זה. So he says, but Rabbeinu didn't rely on this leniency that we see here, right, the tour. להתיר משום דלא אמר הראש כן, אלא לדת המתינים. Because the Rosh only said this regarding the ones who are lenient, doesn't mean, right, that's halacha. למדוד קמח ביום טוב, to measure flour on יום טוב, אבל לא לדת האוסרים. But it says not according to the ones that are forbidding this. וכיוון שהריף והרמב"ם והעיטור פסקו כדת האוסרים, so it says since all these rabbis paskin like, to be stringent, אין להתיר, so therefore we shouldn't, right, allow such a thing like this. So what does that mean? We shouldn't allow to measure on Yom Tov, right? That's it. So it says also, furthermore, that even according to ones that are permitting this, right? They permit this. The Rosh doesn't say this for sure, right? That it's allowed. It's possible, to be lenient, but not for sure. And he says therefore that we shouldn't rely on this to be lenient. This is also this Rabbeinu Yerucham says. Okay. So he says again, right, on Passover, some allow you to measure, right, the matzah dough, right, whatever, the matzah flour. Some forbid this. So he says the ikar, right, the halacha seems to be that we should forbid. וכן דת הגאות מימוניות, also this rabbi, שכתבו בהלכות יום טוב, they wrote over there in the laws of יום טוב, פרק ד' בליל יום טוב של פסח, it says the night of the יום טוב of Passover, שצריך לעשות ג' מצות, you have to make 3 מצות, right, for the mitzvah, של מצווה, וצריך לעשות שיעור חלה, you have to make also the חלה, to separate the חלה, לא ימדוד אלא אילוש בשני פעמים. So he says you shouldn't measure it, right, as we said, to be precise. So what should you do? Right? He says, knead it twice. And each time you put like right, less than a half, I'm sorry, more than a half of the size. But the Ran says, they're not to measure, right, the flour on Yom Tov. But he says, you know what? That when it comes to Passover, where the woman needs to measure, so it's not any worse than the spice for the baker, which is allowed. So in other words, this rabbi seems to allow, he's more lenient, the Ran, right? He's more lenient about this when it comes to Passover, that you're allowed to measure. Okay, interesting, right? So we'll see how the halacha is in the Shulchan Aruch. We're done with this chapter here in the Bet Yosef. Okay, good.
Which
Yes.
rabbi allowed the leniency? I'm sorry.
Of what?
Allowed to knead when on Yom Tov for Passover?
Right. So let's take a look at this again. One more time. Right. So it says that וכן דת הגות מימוניות, right? הגות מימוניות שכתבו בהלכות יום טוב בליל יום טוב של פסח שצריך לעשות ג' מצוות. Yeah, so this is, yeah, Hagot
Um,
Mamaniot. And then he brings here Aval Ran, but he says the Ran, right? So in other words, Hagot Mamaniot is stringent, and the Ran
okay.
is lenient, right? The Ran.
Thank you.
Okay, good. So let's go to Shulchan Aruch and see what happens over there. So says Shulchan Aruch, "Afa pi she'en modedin kemach b'yom tov lalush." So he says, even though, right, on Yom Tov in general, you're not allowed to measure flour, right, for kneading. Not allowed to do that. Do estimation. A little bit more, a little bit less, right, as we said. ביום טוב של פסח שאין לשין עיסה גדולה מהמיסרון, מותר לנדוד. But he says, when it comes to Passover, right, that we can't do more than 3.5 pounds. So he said, therefore it's allowed, right? Why is that, by the way? Because it's a mitzvah, right, here. What's the mitzvah? That you shouldn't make it too big. The rabbis commanded you not to make it too big, right? So therefore, since you're doing a mitzvah by measuring it for the sake of a mitzvah, so therefore it's allowed, right? Which is like the Ran we just mentioned, right? More or less. So he's lenient like the Ran, the Shulchan Aruch here. And then he brings the other opinion, right? So it says, this is a Hagot Maimonides, right, that we just saw. That he's stringent. So he says, right, according to him, do like estimation, right? And just make sure it's not bigger than 3.5 pounds. So, right, so what's halacha? Halacha is like the first opinion. Stam veyesh, halacha kemo stam, right? I hope I don't have to explain that to you anymore. I explained it already about 100 times. But if you want, I'll do it again. If there's any requests, I'll tell you again what it means. Okay, so anyway, right, that's it. We're done with the chapter here. If any questions, let me know. Thanks for coming. Be blessed with wealth, health, happiness. We'll see you tomorrow, Bezat Hashem. Okay, so right, yeah, we have some good news, right? So Bibi came right on tonight, in Israel, and he announced that right 3/4 of the Nazis have been eliminated over there. So there's only 1/4 left, Baruch Hashem. I guess in a month or two, they'll be able to finish it off, hopefully, right? By Passover, I guess all the Nazis should be wiped out, Bezat Hashem, or whatever it is, right? They want to do with them, capture them, whatever, torture them, whatever they want to do, right? Let them do whatever they think is right. They know what they're doing. Okay, so Bezat Hashem, we'll see you tomorrow. Laila Tov, Chazak Baruch.
Kabot Haraf, thank you so much.
All the best.